Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to New America. It's a great pleasure to A, welcome you, and B, welcome our two distinguished speakers who have published a paper really looking at what the future of Iraq holds. It's a very timely paper because, as you know, on May 12th, Iraq has its parliamentary elections. It's also the day that President Trump can choose to pull out of the Iran deal, should he choose to do so. So Doug and Bartle are going to talk a little bit about the main findings of their paper. We'll open it up to a larger discussion. Doug is a former director for the NSC for Iraq. He's also a senior fellow here at ASU, senior fellow here at New America. Frequently in Iraq, does business in Iraq, was there in February. And Bartle is also had a long association with Iraq, started reporting there in 2004, has been back there frequently since, is writing a history of Iraq, beginning with Abraham. He's got to the 19th century, but the book is, he also does business in Iraq and was there most recently in July. So these are two of the world's leading experts on the subject, and we're very lucky to have them here, and I'm going to turn it over to Doug.
Thanks very much. Thanks to all of you for coming. Bartle and I are very happy to have our paper, Iraq After ISIS. We didn't commercially print any public copies, but there's nothing stopping you from getting the PDF and printing it off yourself. Very quickly, a word of thanks both to Peter, who gave us the green light to go ahead and publish this paper, and to David Sturman, who did our editing, the typesetting, fact-checking, re-footnoted the footnotes. A huge thanks to David for everything he did to make this paper possible. Iraq's in a really, well, Iraq is in a far better place today than certainly any of us, even the most optimistic of us, would have templated in the dark days in 2014 when ISIS was coming down to Baghdad. And even those of us who had who had slightly cooler heads. I mean, I was on CNN frequently saying, no, Baghdad is not going to fall, Baghdad is not going to fall, Baghdad's not going to fall, to somewhat incredulous interviewers. But even so, where Iraq is today is shockingly good. By no means perfect, but given the depth of despair that Iraq was in just 4 years ago, we really are in a remarkable place. And I think we just need to state that up front, that the Iraqis as a people have really shown their resilience, and that Iraq as a people mostly pulled themselves out of this themselves. Yes, a lot of help from the United States, a lot of help from international institutions. We'll talk about later, the World Bank and the IMF have been quite helpful. A number of countries, most notably the Germans, have been very engaged with Iraq. The coalition under first General Allen and then Brett McGurk brought to Iraq in terms of the air power, the intelligence sharing, the training, the equipping, all really contributed. But fundamentally, the Iraqis did this themselves. The Iraqis paid this price in blood. They were the ones who decided how Iraq was going to be reconquered and in what order. In 2014, the Americans wanted to go straight to Mosul, and the Iraqis were clear, no, we're going to liberate Anbar first, and then and only then head north. So this is the Iraqis' victory. We both need to celebrate it with them, and I think that will be an important theme of what we talk about today. Because this victory is the Iraqis' victory, it has an entirely different flavor than earlier events. This is not 2008, where it was primarily the United States with some Iraqi cooperation, but primarily the United States that defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was a United States victory, clearly. Good for Iraq, but a United States victory. This one is an entirely different flavor. Primarily, the bulk of what happened this last time, since 2014, is all about the Iraqis, and it's the Iraqi story. So let me talk about two issues before I hand it off to my co-author. I'll first talk about where we are in terms of the security situation in Iraq. As the former military officer, I'm the one who gets to do this. I've been going to Iraq since 2004. So as I was telling a client not too long ago, I've now pretty much have 14 years on this file, with a notable exception of 1 year that I spent in Afghanistan in 2010 when it was the new black. But now back to Iraq. So let's talk about security in Iraq briefly. Again, this is a remarkable turnaround. And I think any objective observer has to now say that the Iraqis have one of the best militaries, if not the best military, in the region, or at least the best ground forces. Let's be more precise. The best ground forces in the region. Again, an incredible turnaround for an Iraqi army that was quite frankly humiliated by its performance in 2014. But again, fast forward 4 years, and you have an army that's able to do some quite amazing things, to do bridging operations. And this may not sound very important to those of you who don't do military affairs, but professional officers know bridging operations are complicated, really complicated. And the Iraqis, in several instances, at Ramadi, at a few times in Nineveh, were able to conduct military operations going over military bridges that were laid for the purpose of getting forces across the rivers that characterize Iraq. So if not the best ground forces in the region, certainly a strong competitor, especially the counterterrorism service, about which we'll talk more. So this is great. Moving forward, though, we need to have a shift in effort. We need to be thinking about two things: police training and domestic intelligence. So ISIS has been conquered as a ground-holding force. This is a very, very good thing. That does not mean that there is no longer ISIS in Iraq. We know that there are pockets in Diyala. We know that there are pockets up by Kirkuk. There continues to be a small presence in the town of Tarmiya, something that haunted me in 2004 and 2007 is still a problem. This little town in the very northeast corner of Baghdad province that traditionally serves as a conduit from Kirkuk and Diyala into Baghdad itself. So there are still pockets of ISIS, and there are still sleeper cells. So Iraq is going to have to transform its security forces to focus on this. These are two entirely different problems. For the last 4 years, we knew exactly where ISIS was. They were in Mosul. They were there. Knowing where ISIS was not a difficulty. Anyone over 5 years old knew where they were. The problem was getting to them and getting them out, which was a very complex military problem. Going forward, that problem is once again going to flip. If you can find ISIS, they're going to be very, very easy to take care of. It's going to be a police problem. A couple guys with handguns will be able to go and physically arrest them because they're going to be hiding in houses or where have you. But the finding of them, that's going to be the trick. How do you find ISIS members who are no longer part of an organized, armed, quasi-uniform force and are now hiding dispersed among the population? That's going to be the challenge for Iraqi security forces going forward. That's a police matter, it's an internal intelligence matter, and that's where the Iraqis are going to need to turn their attention to. The army needs to be refocused on the borders, on repelling armed military threats. Let's face it, Iraq lives in a tough neighborhood, and while I'm not projecting that any military is going to cross those borders in force tomorrow, nonetheless, that's what armies need to prepare themselves to do. From a U.S. perspective, we are talking about the U.S.-Iraq relationship, engagement with the United States industrial base, the United States military industrial base. We, of course, believe it is very much in the interests of Iraq to have a strong relationship with the United States that is reflected in its engagement with the military base, and U.S. policy needs to think about that. U.S. policy needs to think about what are exports, if perhaps some export regimes need to be waived for Iraq, and if some capabilities needed to be gifted to Iraq, so that that helps then set them up to make purchases of U.S. defense items more logical as Iraq's economy continues to recover as they develop a non-oil sector and continue to expand their oil sector. And finally, a U.S. training mission in Iraq makes sense for everyone involved. It's very clear to everyone that the performance of the Iraqi army, its ability to do these bridging operations, the magnificent performance of the counterterrorism service occurred almost solely because of the U.S. training, high-end training that were given to these forces. And both recouping, regenerating the counterterrorism service, which took horrendous casualties in Mosul in particular, but in all the earlier battles as well, should be a national priority for both countries. I'll talk very quickly about domestic politics. Iraq has an election coming up on May the 12th, coincidentally the same day that there's a JCPOA decision here in town, about which I will not talk further unless asked. There are a couple very interesting trends going into this election. Now, there are interesting trends. The question is, how much will these trends be actualized? How much will they make a difference? How mature will these trends be? But there are at least two. The first is the presence of cross-sectarian lists. Both Prime Minister Abadi's list, about which the United States is quite enthusiastic, the victory list, and the Ahadi al-Amri's conquest list, that with the PMUs, about which we are notably less excited, are running serious candidates in Sunni areas, in Anbar, in Nineveh. In Nineveh, Prime Minister Abadi's list is led by the former defense minister, Khalid Obeidi, who is a fairly popular figure in Nineveh. It is not beyond the realm of the possible that the victory list could get 2, 3, or even more seats based off the popularity of Khalid Obeidi in Nineveh. So this will very much change the dynamic of Iraqi politics when what we would normally call a Shia list has 3 candidates from Nineveh internal to it, or 2 or 3 more candidates from Anbar internal to it, and has a significant number of Sunni candidates elected by Sunni bases from Sunni provinces internal to its list. We're not used to thinking about that. We're used to Shia lists having to make deals with Sunni lists to get cross-sectarian governments moving. This could change the dynamic. The second thing we have are reform parties. Barham Saleh's Democracy and Justice Party, Iraqis for Change, led by Dr. Bassett in Baghdad, the Hikmah list, led by the former head of ISKI, and the New Generation movement, being led by Mr. Abdul Wahid, who owns a television network up in Kurdistan. All these movements have remarkably similar platforms. They're all talking about youth, they're all talking about anti-corruption, they're all talking about private sector jobs, they're all talking about federalism. So they all have very interesting things that we want to hear. The question is, how well will any of these movements do? The last polls I saw all 4 of those movements polling at 1% or less. So I don't think we're going to see them as a significant force in this election. What will be interesting, though, to look forward is, what does this mean for 2022 and 2026? Will these movements be able to continue to push back against the big traditional parties that we're used to hearing from? I'll stop there. There are lots of internal trends I didn't talk about. I deliberately did not talk about the PMUs. We can do that in our discussion or the Q&A. I deliberately did not talk about the Kurds. We can talk about that in greater detail. But those are the big trends I think we see moving forward in these 2 areas. I'll turn over to Bartle to talk about some other sectors. But in terms of the security situation and the domestic politics, I think those are the major muscle movements at present.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Let me first say what a pleasure it is to be here. I've long been a great fan of the New America Foundation. Peter Bergen has been an inspiration to many people in my business for years. And Doug's been a good friend since we started working on the RAND Corporation's Iraq Study Group 10 years ago. And we both started our stories in Iraq in 2004. And I see other friends here. Very nice. So thank you all. I'm going to start by focusing on what kind of cooperation I think we should hope for from the U.S. with Iraq on the non-military side. First, educational and cultural programs. There have been all sorts over the years. I believe that these are all on ice in different ways currently, but there have been programs to send Iraqi students to the United States for master's, doctoral degrees. At least 1,200 of those students have gone back to Iraq. I've met numerous of them making contributions and so on. These are all very positive things. The cultural side is maybe of particular interest to me, but I think it can be fairly impactful. Interestingly, antiquities and early cultural matters in Iraq I found to be something that can be very unifying because it predates any current religious schisms and so on. It's also a very good way for a power like the United States, with its complicated record in Iraq, to show real respect for Iraq and for things that bring people together. And in that sense, I believe anyway, cultural heritage can be a unusually efficient way to achieve some of the things that are important to us. On the economic side of things, there are numerous areas where the United States has been very, very helpful, very impactful, and we can continue to be so. One of the great successes of these last few years, and I don't mind repeating what Doug says about the remarkable success of Iraq over these years. I mean, for those of us who have devoted a lot of our lives to the country, it's something we're immensely proud of and reminds us, I think, one reason we've been committed to this country since we first encountered it. What an extraordinary thing Iraq has achieved over these last few years. I think really unique in the history of countries in its circumstances. A third of its territory occupied by what became a fairly well-funded group. The oil price fell by 60% at the exact same time, at a time when, as now and as before, the entire economy, or the entire GDP, really was driven by oil, certainly all government revenues. During these years, among other things, many of which Doug's already mentioned, the United States was very helpful to Iraq in terms of international lending, for example, so with the IMF, the World Bank. And that kind of lending can not only provide really important liquidity to a government when it needs it, but it usually also comes with strings attached in terms of economic liberalization and so on. And Iraq, where much of Saddam's old Leviathan economy is still in place and something we need to talk about. So we were very helpful. We've been helpful there. Just last year, Iraq had $2 billion bond issues, both of them arranged by JP Morgan, Citibank, and Deutsche Bank. The first of these had a U.S. government guarantee, the second didn't. And Iraq, in dealing with the IMF, the World Bank, and other international funders, has been proving over the years, among other things, its technical capacity. There's a great deal of technical capacity in Iraq for dealing with these major international institutions. But the United States has been very, very helpful, very catalytic. Again, that guarantee for the first big Eurobond last year. Enormous influence at the IMF and so on. In terms of the private sector, there's also a lot that the U.S. can be doing. The context in which we need to be doing it, the current context for that is really important to note. It's driven by Prime Minister Abadi. He is one of the very, very few international leaders of now, and I think we have to accept, a man of global stature, what he has helped his country to overcome with probably the bare minimum of of the inevitable, regrettable sides of the kind of war he just had to win. But this is a man who I think would, in any room full of global leaders, is any man's equal. And a very important part of thing to remember about him is that he has a personal background in the entrepreneurial private sector. He had a successful, albeit small, engineering business in London, and he comes to his work with that background. He has set up in the Prime Minister's office an economic reforms unit. They've got, I know at least a couple cases of young Iraqis from world-class international financial institutions who've gone back to Baghdad. They're working on this. Much of what they do has to go through Parliament. Parliament isn't really dealing with anything until the elections now, right? But these, this is working hard to modernize the economy, which direly needs it. To take one sector as an example, the banking sector, 90% of the banking sector is in the hands of a couple of enormous old Saddam-era banks. There's a handful of small private sector banks, but they're not lending money for people to buy cars or buy houses or start businesses and so on. All of that is in desperate need of modernization, liberalization. All business banking, just about all business banking goes through something called the Trade Bank of Iraq. So it and these two old, huge retail banks should probably see parts of what they do privatized and so on. Financial markets reform is another big place where the U.S. can help. Iraq's stock market has a total capitalization about $13 billion. That's 5% of the Iraqi economy. In Saudi Arabia next door, with roughly the same number of people, call it 30 million, probably once exploration has got more serious again in Iraq, probably same order of magnitude of oil wealth. So same number of people next door, roughly the same amount of oil wealth. The Saudi stock market represents 65% of GDP, right? 5% versus 65%. And that's not cherry picking. That would be something similar with other neighbors, including even Iran. And these stock markets are places that growing businesses go to raise money to grow more, for the most part. And that's another great example of modernization, liberalization, reform that needs to happen in Iraq, where we can be very, very helpful. The economy is dominated by oil, and still in a very old-fashioned way. Again, ripe for reform in a few ways. Let me give one example. Iraqis receive a monthly food basket. The biggest, it's not literally a basket, but it is, it is food, and distributed at 15 to 20,000, mostly small, corner markets and shops around the country. Imagine the corruption that involves. Imagine the negative signal that sends to people about their own worth and enterprise and relationship with the state. Iraq will need to, if it's truly to prosper and be free and happy, will need to avoid the oil curse. The best way, in my opinion, for Iraq to do that is through individual oil accounts, as is done in different ways in Norway or Alaska, where people receive their share of their country's oil revenues, and their leaders ask for it back in the form of taxes agreed by people's elected representatives. Ambitious, perhaps, but it would be an enormously impactful way to help Iraq avoid the oil curse with all its familiar problems. More general modernization, just about everything you can think of: land ownership, starting companies, closing down companies, access to visas for international investors, and engineers, and so on. All of this needs to be modernized, and again, the United States is in a unique position to help. Separate topic, which I'll hit very briefly so we can all talk about it together later, but reconstruction and reintegration. Estimates for just the physical plant, so to speak, that needs to be the rebuilding that needs to happen after the war with ISIS in the West and North, estimates in the range of $50 billion. Recent Reconstruction conference in Kuwait, a good $30 billion was in terms of actual loans, of giving, of soft loans, and so on, but $30 billion was pledged. That conference is much more successful, in my opinion, than it was given credit for, but still the work is enormous. Most of this reconstruction has to happen, again, in the west and north of the country. Happens also to be the most mixed, much of it anyway, the most mixed and diverse part of the country, and so should be a major part of our focus anyway. I'll conclude with a quick little tour of the horizon of neighbors and try to talk a little bit about regional diplomacy. Starting in the South, Kuwait, again, just hosted this conference. Interesting, that alone is interesting in the context of Iraq's history with Kuwait, of course. And very successful, contrary to the usual, much of the pessimism that it was greeted with. These loans include $3 billion from the U.S. Exim Bank. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, of course, so important here. I think useful to start talking about Iraq's relations with Saudi and the UAE with a very big picture point. What's obviously on their mind is Iran, as it is with many people, right? Now, a big picture point here, and I'll bring it up because it often arises when I talk to Saudis about Iraq. Many will say, oh, well, we'll write it off as if it were Lebanon, and maybe Lebanon should not be written off, but they will see it that way. Write it off to Iran. It's inevitably going to be Iran, so we can just try to make things, perhaps spend a little time trying to make things as less bad as possible, but just consigning this to Iran. I clearly want major reason to think that way is that Iraq is 65% Shia. Shiism is a religion shared between Iraq and Iran. But a very important point is that Iraq is a greatly more promising a friend and ally and situation for the Saudis and their Gulf allies than many of them understand, in my opinion. First of all, of course, Iraqis are Arabs. They are not Persians. They share that Arab ethnicity, except for the Kurds in the north. But for the bulk of Iraqis, whether they're Sunnis or Shias, they are Arabs. They're not Persians. Iraq's Shias fought very hard for their Sunni minority government under the tyrannical Saddam against the mullah regime in Iran. The Iraqi brand of Shiism is entirely different from Khomenism, the rule of the religious leaders in Iran. The traditional form of Shiism continues to be the dominant one in Iraq, which sees this Iranian brand, Khomenism, the rule of the religious leaders, as anathema. So for these and other reasons, there's real potential for relations to be better between Iraq and Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies. And we've seen this. I mean, the greatest firebrand, radical rebel Shia cleric of Iraq, Muqtada al-Sadr, was visited the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia last year. And within 2 weeks, for the first time since Saddam's day, the land border with Saudi Arabia was open, and I believe flights had started. So there's real potential there. The Saudis are building a $1 billion, 70,000-person soccer stadium in Baghdad. The UAE has devoted $100 million, or says they will, to the rebuilding of the great Sunni mosque in Mosul. So we see a major rapprochement going on, I think probably for some of the reasons we just mentioned. Going around the neighbors, Jordan next. The Jordanian port of Aqaba is very important to Iraq's future. It's a place for imports to come into Iraq from rather than from Iran, right? Iraqis don't want cheap Iranian cola and other consumer things. They want to be part, like the rest of the world, of the growing global economy. The Jordanian, our close ally, Jordan, the Jordanian port of Aqaba is a natural place for some of that to come through. Iraq, Baghdad and Amman have announced a oil pipeline from the southern Iraq to the Jordanian port of Aqaba that would move 1 million barrels per day of Iraqi oil, and 150,000 to 200,000 of those would then stay in Jordan to be refined there. There's also been significant security cooperation in the war against ISIS and to some extent to do with the Syrian situation. In Syria, Iraq's been working very hard to avoid that quagmire, but I believe it was only last week that for the first time the Iraqi Air Force conducted combat operations, certainly of this kind, outside of Iraqi borders since, I think, 1991, Iraqi F-16s bombing ISIS in Syria with the coordination, I believe, between Damascus and the American side. Turkey is an interesting one. They, too, have an election coming up, as we all know. Turkey, after its recent adventures in the north of Syria, doesn't have much room for movement there, but pursuing the Kurds in Iraq, as in, or the PKK, Turkish Kurdish rebels in Iraq, as in Syria, is a big vote winner for Erdogan. I think we can probably expect Turkey to be more aggressive in the north of Iraq, in the very far north of Iraq, in the mountains. You've probably been there, Peter. I did when I was doing this stuff. Where the PKK, the, again, Turkish Kurdish rebels, have their military bases inside Iraq, in the north of Iraq, in the mountains. Turkey now has a fully fledged defense infrastructure, building their own roads, semi-permanent camps, physically in Iraq. That's something we often forget. For the moment, Baghdad can live with it, but it's not a sustainable part of a sovereign country, needless to say. And then, of course, Iran. A short way of putting it is, of course, Iran wants as much influence as possible in Iraq. From Iraq's point of view, and also from ours, that's generally malign. The appeal to Iraqis is much less than many will understand, partly for the reasons that we mentioned in the context of the Saudis and the UAE, but also in terms of Iraqi domestic life and domestic politics. The mullah's Iran is just simply not an attractive example. In an electoral context, trying to sell that or sell closeness to that is no vote winner for this very courageous and free people of Iraq. But it's really important to point out, and Doug made sure we did it in this paper, that Iraq will always be close to Iran. It's an enormous land border. It's an enormous shared history. In Iranian culture itself, there's nothing to fear. And so we've also got to, as much as it's almost job number one to counter Iran's malign, or the Tehran's malign influence in Iraq, it is also really important to understand that much of Iran in Iraq is natural, and to be sure always to distinguish there. And I'll leave it at that, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you paint a picture which I was in Iraq in December, and it was the first time I felt that Iraq had a better chance of success than Afghanistan, which Doug has been saying for many, many years now. Part of that, of course, is oil, a much better educated population, and part of it is the violence is subsiding. So, what could go wrong? And I mean, let me throw out, what happens when Sistani dies? Is there kind of a sort of plan B for that? And why is it important that he kind of not die tomorrow?
I think there's a tendency on the part of Americans to personify everything in Iraq. We were all in with Chalabi, we were then all in with Alawi, we were then all in with Maliki, we're now all in with Abadi, and through this whole period we've been all in with Sistani. Sistani has clearly been a magnificent and stabilizing figure during this entire 14-year period. When I first got to, and he's a very old man now. When I first got to Iraq in 2004, we were asking the "what happens when Sistani dies next year" question then, and here we are. The bottom line, though, is this is not the first rodeo. This is not the first time a grand Ayatollah has died in Najaf. I think it's unusual to have one grand Ayatollah who has this level of prominence. I think usually, Sistani does have this position right now, at least in Iraq, as the Shia Pope. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think more traditionally, Iraqi Shiism tends to be more orthodox, with power more diffused between competing grand Ayatollahs. But the answer to what happens when Sistani passes is the three remaining grand Ayatollahs will agree between themselves which of them steps up to have a place of primacy. And they will then start looking to the next generation for someone, another one or two younger clerics to promote into their ranks to maintain continuity. They do this. They've been doing this for a long time. And the idea that Sistani's passing then means that Iran can parachute some candidate in to become, just add water grand Ayatollah, has always been ridiculous. Yeah. The idea that, I don't know who the next grand Ayatollah is going to be, but I know it's going to be one of those three. The only thing that could lead to some interesting turmoil in Najaf were if the other three grand Ayatollahs to pass before him, then Sistani passed, and this all happened in relatively rapid succession. Mm-hmm. That could present a challenge to Najaf's ability to regenerate itself. Not that it wouldn't, but there would be a period of weakness there. But so long as there are three other grand Ayatollahs sitting in Najaf, and they're not young men either, so it is not implausible that all four of them could pass in a relatively short period of time. That's really the only thing I think we need to be concerned about.
Here's another potential wild card, which is some kind of rump part of ISIS going back into Syria, merging perhaps with elements of Al-Qaeda or not, and then trying to basically do what they did in 2014, which is reinvade Iraq. Is that remotely possible?
Well, I think part of this answer is the military answer, and what could go wrong that would be is that something else you may have been about to ask, Peter, but that's connected to that. The United States could leave as completely as it did militarily and diplomatically in 2011. I don't think any of us think 2011 and the ISIS invasion would have happened if the United States had, if the 10th Mountain Division had been a few miles outside of any of these cities. So I think it's very, very unlikely now, but the other, in that sense. But the other key thing to look at, of course, the rise of ISIS and its success, much of it imposed, but some of it welcomed by some in these parts of Iraq, is that the Sunni population were profoundly disaffected.
Yeah.
And to return to the days of Shia sectarian rule is another big thing.
Yeah.
It could go wrong.
But both of you are indicating that seems pretty unlikely for the moment.
I think it's deeply unlikely. I think there's, a huge part of the success of 2014 with ISIS was they did find in many places in the Sunni north some level of sympathy, either grudging sympathy or to enthusiastic sympathy. And they were received among the population. They had places to hide. They had places, people who cooperated with them. I think today a reinvasion of Nineveh and Anbar would find somewhere in the neighborhood of zero acceptance. They have now, Iraq's Sunni population has now seen what it means to live under an Islamist system, and I don't think they want any part of it ever again. They welcomed their liberation from that by a largely Shia army coming from the south was welcomed. They found the occupation of ISIS to be that distasteful.
So you mentioned the counterterrorism service. It's a relatively inexpensive line item in the U.S. budget, the support we give to that. Clearly, I mean, so tell us what does the future look like for the counterterrorism service? Kind of what kind of level of support it needs.
You want to take that?
I think you probably should, Doug, because you know a lot more about
There's
that. Thank you.
I mean, this is a relatively, as you say, relatively easy. They need help from U.S. Special Forces trainers to do a number of things, to do assessment, with any high-end military force, figuring out who you should bring into the training and who you should not is the first major step. There needs to be some type of assessment, selection. Do you have the aptitude for this? Do you have the skills? Are you literate enough? Et cetera. So that's the first step. And then, look, we have a lot of experience training high-end special forces, both our own and other countries. This is not our first rodeo. This is not the only special forces unit we've trained around the world. And clearly, we did okay with this group. They performed magnificently. That said, they're pretty much shattered and may not have the capability to regenerate themselves internally. I think once they are reestablished, we're not going to have to do this forever. Sooner or later, you get these people back, and then they have the ability to regenerate themselves internally. But when you've been so decimated, and when you're to have an internal capacity to replace 10% casualties, you have to be able to do. To replace 60% of your force, you might need some outside help, and we've demonstrated we know how to do this.
The head of the counterterrorism service was denied a visa to the United States during the travel ban episode. How did that go over in Iraq?
Yeah, perversely, the travel ban issue in Iraq actually turned out okay. I mean, the people who were denied visas during that period were obviously quite upset. But at the end of the day, I think the Iraqis were so happy to be pulled off the list that they saw that, oh, yeah, they accidentally batched us with these other countries, but then cooler heads prevailed, and people who understand the importance of this relationship got involved, and I think it reinforced to Iraq as a country that, oh, we do have friends in the United States. And maybe there was this rash initial decision, but they pulled back from it. And I think perversely, relations with Iraq are better for that decision having been pulled back than had they not been on the list in the first place.
And on the Shia militias, I mean, there was great concern that there would be these kind of retaliatory sort of sectarian, I mean, and presumably there was a little bit of that, but how do you score where they are right now? And are they being pulled back into the Iraqi conventional army?
Peter, I'll take the first part of that at least. I think that the key point about the militias is a big picture one, and I really must credit this to Doug, and I think it's profound, that the solution there is for them not to be needed by the communities that give them support.
Yeah.
And that it's security, and then beyond that, prosperity. But first, security at home that makes these people unnecessary and irrelevant, and that's probably our ultimate solution there. Now, where are things currently? So a certain amount of these militia members have been budgeted for in the most recent budget. So there we have, okay, the Iraqi state is now, subsidizing these guys. Or is it trying to bring them into the fold? Then there's the question, another argument, how much are these budgets, right? So yes, they were budgeted for, but I forget the numbers, but as I recall, this was a number so low from the point of view of most of the militias. We should also remember they're Christian and Sunni militias too. When we were writing this, the best numbers I could come up with, they were maybe 60, 70, not even 70, maybe 60% Shia. That very significant minority of these militias are Christian, Yazidi, Shia. Turkmen. But at any rate, that even when a budget is made that kind of legitimizes them, that itself may be a budget that, from the point of view of the big Shia militias, doesn't give them nearly enough money to recognize their needs and their importance, and so on. So I think that it gets mostly through improving security at home, but also these ways gets whittled away. I mean, it's very, very hard, as we argue in the paper, to make this go away immediately. I don't think it's a terrible stain on Abadi's record that he didn't just pretend they weren't there, or try militarily to disband them or disarm them.
A couple thoughts. I mean, first of all, we need to remember that in some ways, this is a problem the United States created. In the spring of 2014, when Iraq was in its moment of need and ISIS was sweeping through Mosul towards Baghdad, the Iranians decided this would be a really good time to bank political capital. They got into Iraq and helped organize the PMUs. The United States decided this would be a good time to spend political capital, and notably said, we're not helping you until you get rid of Nouri al-Maliki. And that took about 3 months. So we made a policy decision to leave the ground to the Iranians and the PMUs for 3 months. And Iraqi voters are going to remember this. And this is why there's a Hashid conquest party right now. They have a lot of street cred. They are the ones who were out there first and who kept ISIS from coming to Baghdad. And I don't think people are going to forget that in this electoral cycle. That said, I think the PMU are definitely at their apogee. There's as each day goes along, the need for the PMU diminishes, and each day that goes by, people's memories of the events of 2014 are going to fade. So do I think the PMU list is going to do well in this election? Yes, I do. Do I think that this is a one-time legacy event that doesn't have long tails, that there's a very small chance of what is called the Hezbollahization of Iraq? Yes, I think these are very low probability events, that the PMU have a long tail. I think the PMU will be integrated into the Iraqi security forces. But the analogy I use, and this will take me just a minute, is one of when the United States was forced to put a National Guard division headquarters in Iraq in 2005. And of course, Big Army was very, very concerned about this. But politically, it was important to send a National Guard headquarters to Baghdad. So it went, and it went with its commander. We put an active duty deputy commander, I believe. We put an active duty chief of staff. We put an active duty deputy everything. And we attached a couple active duty brigades to it. So by the time it got there, it was really only about 40% National Guard, and trusted agents of the big institution were there. I think you're going to see something very similar happen with the PMUs. The PMUs are now a codified part of the national security structure, reporting straight to the Prime Minister. When you start looking at the requirements, commanders are now going to have certain military educational requirements. Well, a number of the PMU commanders can't read, so they're not going to make this first cut. So I think we're going to see the larger Iraqi security institution absorb the PMUs and turn them into something quite different over time. It's not going to happen this year, or it's not going to happen in total this year. It will happen by attrition little bit by little bit. But I suspect, again, by the next electoral cycle, by 2022, the PMUs are going to be thoroughly neutered and be largely integrated into an Iraqi security force and bear very little resemblance to their prior iteration. I think we need to remember Iraq has done this before. You know, I've been doing Iraq long enough to remember when the counterterrorism force was not the Golden Brigade, it was the Dirty Brigade. It was the brigade that went out and conducted activities on behalf of Nouri al-Maliki, that was seen as the persecutors, the ones who were putting down the Sunni demonstrations. No one remembers that anymore. No one talks about that. That is a deep part of their history. And of course, a lot of the people who were involved in that are no longer part of the CTS. I suspect, strongly suspect, we will see a similar evolution with the PMUs.
So when Abadi came into power, he was sort of regarded, I think, as sort of weak and feckless and sort of a caretaker. And I mean, the situation is different today, right? Because the Kurds scored this big own goal. He defeated ISIS. You're saying the PMUs are kind of, you know, going to be part of the regular force. So when he goes into this election, he's going in with some very good cards, right?
Big time. You know, he's running on the two big victories, the victory over ISIS and this seizing back of almost all of the disputed territories with the Kurds, almost bloodlessly, including Kirkuk and all of its oil. He's running on a third thing as well, which is a more modern approach to the economy. He's running hard. I mean, they're campaigning in every single province. I think for the first time at this scale for a major Shia-dominated list, for example, in all three of the Kurdish provinces. And usually these big lists do attract a few members of the other sect, and so on. But as Doug says, you know, in Nineveh province, just with one example, the Sunni component of Abadi's party or list in Iraq's case is you know, is a serious local heavyweight. So he's, but I think probably the greatest move after ISIS was to secure his nationalist flank by reclaiming these disputed territories with the Kurds.
Abadi really has become a nationalist leader. We saw a brand new poll come out yesterday. It shows Abadi has 60% approval overall in the country. What's interesting is when you dig down, his 60% approval, he has a 60% approval among his base, the Shia base in Baghdad and south. He actually has a 70% approval rating in the formerly conquered territories. So in the Sunni areas, he has a 70% approval rating. And then he actually has a 50% approval rating in the Kurdish north. So he's more popular in Anbar than he is in Karbala, perversely. So this could be a very, very different election. Now, again, I want to caveat, it's by no means sure that Abadi wins this election. I do think that's the smart money, but it's by no means certain that he wins this election. One of my major concerns going forward into this election is we do seem to have a narrative here in Washington that if Abadi doesn't win, or perhaps Alawi, although that's never going to happen, that this means the Iranians have won. And I think we need to be very cautious about that kind of narrative. There are all kinds of possibilities of people who could emerge. And again, I think the smart money is still in Abadi getting a second term. But if that doesn't happen, that doesn't mean that somehow that Tehran is now taking over Baghdad.
But since his parliamentary system, there's going to be he's unlikely to just win the election anyway, right? There's going to be some horse trading and some deals. Who are the deals?
There are so many parties that even if Abadi has a wildly successful election, he can't get more than 25% of the seats. And that would be wildly successful. Somewhere in the 17 to 20% range is far more likely.
So who would he ally with to kind of become prime minister?
He would ally with nationalist Sunnis, perhaps led by some of them anyway, led by the former prime minister whom Doug just mentioned, Alawi. I think he'd quite likely ally with the al-Sadr movement, really nationalist Shias, but is significant demographic on the whole. Usually the biggest party in the poor urban slums of Baghdad in the south, and reform-minded Kurds who could do very well. One thing we haven't talked about is just how challenging things are in Kurdistan, how unhappy people are there, how during the Arab Spring, when in the rest of Iraq there were demonstrations for more water and electricity, you know, in Kurdistan, there were, you know, really bloody scenes, and those two capitals could have fallen. So reform-minded Kurds, quite possibly. Out of, I think it's 279 seats in...
I think it's 329, but anyway.
329.
I'm sorry?
I thought you meant the magic number to get it.
Yes, yeah, that's where I was getting at. But I'm probably wrong in the number of seats. But a sort of magic number for Abadi and his, say, two. By the way, sorry, another major faction who've been receiving, as I understand, a fair amount of financial support from Tehran, but who could still ultimately side with Abadi when the dust settles after the election, all the counting is done. The Hakim faction. We could have maybe perhaps 100 out of this 300 odd as his core. Might be the round number for whether or not he can form a relatively strong ministry.
Great, we'll throw it open to questions. If you have a question, can you wait for the mic and identify yourself? And this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Alexander Kravitz from Insight. Thank you for a great panel. I have maybe two questions. One on the PMUs. I wonder, I kind of agree with what the scenario you were painting forward about how they will be eventually taken in. But I wonder if you could give us an idea, maybe drilling down a bit, where are they in numbers? I mean, they have been taken in, you know, there's a budget, and you were talking about the casualty rates of the CTS. I mean, they also had, you know, casualty rates, so they must have lost. I mean, are they recruiting again? If they were, you know, I don't know the number, if they were 100,000 in, you know, 2016, what are their numbers now? Do they continue to recruit? That's the first question. The second question on the banking sector. There's something like, what, 60 or 70 banks that are really more like trading houses, right? Because they have a right to the auction. What needs to happen for those banks to actually become real banks? I mean, I think it's, you know, there's a question of regulatory, but also the entrepreneurial zest. I mean, if you have one of those golden licenses, you essentially are printing gold, you know, through the auction. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Great. Would you like me to
Go
start
ahead.
with that one?
Yeah.
Okay, great. First, thanks. Great question. So important. I have to say, I've seen this in other emerging markets around the world, that local banks find that this local business, the local treasury bill business of just lending money to the government at these auctions in return for these nice returns, is just such easy money that they get quite sort of fat and happy doing that. Partly because they have this sort of privileged position of being only ones who can participate in these things and so on, right? So it certainly makes them focus more on real banking activities when that's reformed. Much of it is regulation, but also the position of these huge state behemoths. So, you know, so many people in Iraq get their salaries paid to their accounts at these major state-owned banks and so on. People are used to it, and it's not very profitable it's difficult. It takes a lot of investment and so on for other banks to capture that retail market. And then on the side of business banking, this Trade Bank of Iraq, which is really quite a good institution. I mean, it's well run. It's not corrupt. At least it wasn't when I knew it well for years and years and to the last few years. And I'm sure it's still as good as it ever was, I hope. But you know, it is a good organization. But you know, it has such an advantageous position from this government guarantee that it gets and so on, that it squeezes out, just like the big retail banks do. It squeezes out the others. So I think maybe one of the biggest parts of reform of this banking sector, which is a critical piece of reform in the bigger picture, is to privatize at least parts of both Trade Bank of Iraq on the business banking side and the two giants on the retail side.
You asked a great question about the PMUs. Yes, they took enormous casualties, as should expected. You know, we've seen this before. You know, we're not too far from where the first Battle of Manassas occurred, where you know Union volunteers also went out there and displayed military incompetence and died in huge numbers. The PMUs, you know, this is an identical thing. You know, your nation all of a sudden needs to go from a relatively small professional army to needing tens of thousands more people. People responded. They rushed to the front. They pushed out north of Baghdad, and they knew nothing, and they died in waves. So yes, the casualties of the PMUs in particular, both in the defense of Baghdad and as they pushed up into Tikrit, were very, very high. You asked a great question about their recruiting now. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, about whether they're actively trying to maintain their status or now that pieces of them are regularized, how is recruiting for that happening and what's happening outside that? I honestly don't know the answer to that. That's a great question.
You know, if the president decides to effectively pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement on the same day of this election, what does that mean for Iraq down the road? And what are Iran's likely reactions, particularly related to Iraq, but maybe even also regionally?
You know, Iraq has been quite clear in stating that it recognizes that the United States and Iran aren't particularly friendly with each other, and it would greatly appreciate its two friends finding a place other than Iraq for it to resolve its disputes. I mean, Abadi has essentially said that in words, you know, pretty identical to that. Now, whether the Iranians, and for that matter us, will be willing to acknowledge their request to have this elsewhere, I think that's just remarkably unclear. This is one of the things that concerns me about Iraq. I think Iraq and Iraqis are in a very good place to take care of their own problems.
Yeah.
If they start all of a sudden having problems exported to them from us, from the Syrians, from the Iranians, from the Turks, that may give them problems they're simply not equipped to handle at this point.
Yeah. So this gentleman here.
Yeah, Ken Meyercourt, TV producer. Isn't there widespread sentiment in Iraq demanding the withdrawal of U.S. troops? I think a couple of militia units has said they'll kill any American soldiers who land in Iraq. The Iraqi parliament recently insisted that the government give them a timetable for U.S. withdrawal. Is there any sign that we're going to leave Iraq soon or ever, especially as I believe the Pentagon has stopped listing how many troops we have in Iraq on their website?
I think the Pentagon stopped listing how many troops we have everywhere on their website. So I don't think that's an Iraq-specific issue. No, there's not huge demand in Iraq. There are some very vocal minorities who are quite clear that they would like the American presence to cease and desist. I'm not sure, in fact, I'm quite confident that does not represent the mainstream position. When you talk to representatives of all the parties in Baghdad, even some you would suspect would be less friendly about it. Even the most hostile parties want a 2 or 3 year program to assist with border police and internal policing and then have it reassessed, while the friendlier parties just want something very long term. I strongly suspect that there will be a U.S. presence in Iraq for many years unless the U.S. unilaterally decides to leave. I don't think that's going to happen. The U.S. presence in Iraq, properly tailored, can be in everyone's interest and cross no one's red lines. The U.S. population is very, very interested in having no more U.S. soldiers die in Iraq. It's very clear the U.S. population has had enough of it. Conversely, the Iraqi population has had quite enough of seeing U.S. soldiers on its streets. They don't want to live through that again. Well, fortunately, if you just put U.S. soldiers in the middle of Iraqi military bases, where the only people they encounter are Iraqi soldiers and police as they're training them, well, then their chances of getting killed, unless they, trip and fall in a puddle, is a number approaching zero, and their chance to interact with the Iraqi population and be offensive to them is also a number approaching zero. So properly tailored, I think this presence can be there. It can last a long time. Quite frankly, basing U.S. troops in Baghdad isn't that much more expensive than basing them at Fort Bragg or Fort Hood. So monetarily, it really doesn't cost us very much, and can pay a lot of dividends for Iraqi society, and gives, anytime you're deployed, that's also good for U.S. troops, increasing their capability.
Okay, this gentleman here, this gentleman here, and this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Wright. I'm with the Inspector General's office at DoD. Could you, hopefully these will be two quick questions. First, could you comment on what the trend of insurgency in Iraq looks like? Is it going to continue going down? Is it going to maintain some kind of Naxalite-like slow burn or something else? And also, what happens if Hadi al-Amiri somehow comes out on top and becomes the next prime minister?
You want to take Hadi al-Amiri?
Sure, because I think I can be really brief. I think it's so unlikely as to be. I think it's too unlikely, really, frankly, to spend much time on. But what happens if? It would be I think we would see a lot more of this insurgency, because I think we'd see a lot more fear in the Sunni parts of the country.
But I think in general, since I think we agree that's not going to happen, I think the insurgency is going to continue to decrease. One, the Iraqis are getting better at this internal policing. You can just have to read the reports. They almost daily are pulling out the sleeper cells and finding, people who are from Mosul who are hiding. So I think this is going to be stamped out. But it really comes back to what I was talking about earlier, the lack of tolerance among the Sunni population that, let's be candid, in the 2010 to 2013 period was quite willing, at least in places, to hide these insurgents, to give them sanctuary, to aid and abet. That sentiment is, for the most part, gone. And even the most rejectionist pieces of the Sunni population, the most rejectionist trends, the former Association of Muslim Scholars, are now inside the process, have accepted the legitimacy of this regime, have accepted the legitimacy of elections. So I think the smart money, again, absent the Iranians or the Syrians or the Turks coming in to do something else, extraneous variables could change this. But internal to Iraq itself, the trend is, I think, clearly downward.
And there's no calls, as there have been in some elections, for Sunnis to boycott.
There have been calls for everyone to boycott, but I think almost everyone is not paying attention to those calls.
This gentleman.
My name is Mike Albin. I'm an independent researcher. Thank you very much for an informative panel. My question is about antiquities and culture that you began your remarks with. What is the current status of Iraq-American cooperation in these areas, and what do you foresee developing in the next couple of years? Will we be seeing more students coming to American universities? Will visas be loosened up? That sort of thing. Archaeological digs, for example.
Why don't you take archaeology? I'll do education.
Great.
Go ahead.
So there's quite a few of the American museums that have been historically very involved in Iraq. For example, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and a handful of others in Chicago and Philadelphia that have been digging in Iraq since the 20s and 30s are starting to go back. We have a related thing, a repatriation to our friends in Iraq tomorrow at the ambassador's house of some antiquities. I sit on the visiting committee at the Ancient Near Eastern Department at the Met in New York, and we're sending people back to dig. We are sending people to support the culture ministry in training some of their professionals in logging and documenting artifacts, and so on, just some small examples. So I'd say, it's starting again, and it's really good news. Always room for more, but of course it's expensive.
I think restarting educational exchange is probably the most important thing we need to work on. We have sitting here in the front row Zuhair Humadi, who ran Iraq's higher education program, the exact name of which is in the paper, but I can't recite off the top of my head at the moment. So, thousands of Iraqi students have come here for graduate degrees. Most of them have returned. They have an astronomical, like 99% plus return rate, which for those of you who know the problem of visa overstays in the United States is quite an achievement. So almost everyone on this program who has completed it has gone back. That said, since 2015, because of both, I'm sure, Iraq's monetary situation and their political attention being elsewhere, new students have come. That's something we need to jumpstart as soon as possible. And I think there's room for, there should not be one program sending Iraqi students here. There should be 10 or 20. I would like to see universities throughout the country each reaching out for one, if every Ivy League university grabbed one or two, and every land-grant university grabbed one, well, pretty soon we'd have hundreds of Iraqis studying here again, and I think that's what we need, this interlinking of the two countries. And I think we need a similar renaissance with our military school system. There should be far, far more Iraqi students studying in our, captains in our advanced courses, majors at Leavenworth, colonels in our war colleges, to really build these military ties, since there's no Iraqi senior military officers who don't know tons of Americans at this point. They'd have lots of friends anywhere they came here. To further cement those ties makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. I'm Will Embry from DynCorp International. Could you talk a little bit more about the Reconstruction Conference and the money out of it? I don't really understand it. To me, it seems very soft. It's almost all loans or guarantees. There's no grant money in it. I can't see and some of it's tied to specific countries and specific products. I can't quite see the link between those commitments and actually getting the work done that needs to be done to do the tough, reconstruction stabilization work, none of which is going to actually produce any money. And I also don't see how Iraq's ever going to pay $30 billion back again if they ever do get that amount of money.
Can we just add, Matt Reed, and bundle those questions together just in the interest of time?
Sorry, Peter, did you mean?
We're
We're
going
going to take one more question and then we'll answer both.
Yeah.
Hi, Matt Reed with Foreign Reports and New America. My question is about Kurdistan. Will we see reconciliation between Baghdad and Erbil before the end of the year? And then also, will any new deal be more durable than the last few we've seen?
So, the conference in Kurdistan.
Which do you want?
Why don't you take Kurdistan?
Okay.
I'll take Kuwait.
Here's Iraq's fundamental problem right now with the North. You have the Kurdistan regional government. It is a constitutionally embodied entity that is written into the, its legitimacy cannot be disputed. On the other hand, it has so mismanaged and so taken advantage of its people over the last 5 years. And it is now so deeply in debt. I mean, you wonder how federal Iraq's going to pay back $30 billion. The KRG owes at least, has conceded it owes $22 billion, and I suspect the number is far, far greater. So you now have this sub-state entity that is now in a place where it can no longer be a faithful steward for its people. You know, if Baghdad, in a fit of magnanimity, tomorrow decides to just send $1 billion to the KRG, that money's going to go to Dana Gas or the Turks or Rosneft, to one of their creditors. It's not going to go to pay salaries, let alone do, you know, try to build projects and regenerate their economy. So Baghdad's in a really, there's now a knot here that I don't know how to untie, with the KRG simply being so deeply in debt that it's hard to see a way out of that. And yet at the same time, it is a constitutional entity. So it's not as if Baghdad can legitimately just reabsorb the 3 provinces, although you have heard talk of that, of Baghdad just giving money straight to the 3 provinces and letting them work out their deals, and letting Erbil, not as a province, but as a capital of the northern 3 provinces, die on the vine. I don't know what you have Baghdad do, especially given that if you cut a special deal with Erbil on oil prices, you always have to be looking at the precedent you're setting in the south in Basra. And that, of course, has always been the issue for federal Iraq when dealing with the Kurds. They want a special deal where they get their fair share of Basra oil plus half or more of their own. And that's just not a deal that Baghdad can afford to give to Erbil, because it can never give that deal to Basra. So my bottom line is, I don't know how we get out of this situation in the north.
Quickly there on Kurdistan as a federal region. Okay, so the Constitution mentions federalism dozens and dozens of times. The way that you form a federal unit or region is by a supermajority vote. I can't remember what the level is, 60%, 2/3. In more than one region can vote more than one province can then vote to form a new federal region.
Or one province.
I don't think a single province can make a federal region.
I think they can. But anyway, keep going.
Right. Okay. So it would be somewhere in the reversing of that. There is nothing in the fundamental formation of the state that said that this is a separate entity. So the undoing would be an undoing of something that is, you know, post-formation. I don't know what the undoing is, but that's less of a project than something that was separate from the beginning. But at the same time, I think what this shows us, as the rest of Iraq goes better, right, and this is another example of the sort of strengthening of the Iraqi state, and how Doug and I came together last year to write this piece, because we'd seen in so many ways that this sense of a nation, and it's one of the first words in our first sentence, as I call, you know, national sentiment, right, in all sorts of ways, is at an all-time high. Remarkable for a country with all those challenges in terms of having one national sentiment. In terms of Kuwait, foreign reconstruction money, and so on. I mean, ultimately, first of all, any of these conferences, it's a promise. It's a promise of a gift, or if it's a promise of a guarantee. Well, a cheap guarantee is, of course, a gift. Is it worse than a full gift? In many ways, it's better. All things people can disagree on, but what we probably all agree is that Iraq's reconstruction is ultimately its own responsibility, and that there is no shortage of money, right? This is an immensely wealthy country, wealthy in its people, wealthy in its natural resources, and its its stability and a more modern liberal economy that are going to give Iraqis the wealth that they deserve and that they're going to need for all this reconstruction. I mean, ultimately, that's where it all really has to come from. There is no shortage of that money. And as I said earlier on, there's a list of very of things that we can do that take a great deal of work, but that can really help this important ally.
Let me add just very brief, because I was in Kuwait. I think the thing that made it confusing is everyone insisted on calling it an investment conference. And that's not really what it was. The Iraqis wanted access to international capital so they can borrow money to build infrastructure to get themselves out of an economic hole. They're going to do in 2019 what the United States did in 2008. Find shovel-ready projects, borrow the money to get people working. The issue was calling it an investment conference. And as I've learned the hard way, Iraqis just mean different things by investment than Westerners do. And God knows I know Iraqis, but thanks to their Ba'athist history, they're essentially communists. And they do not think about investment. They do not think of investment the way we think of investment. That is a generation away for Iraq. So the way to look at Kuwait is, did it give them a line of credit for them to get infrastructure projects moving in Iraq, to get their economy jump-started, get people back to work? And the answer to that is yes, and therefore it was a successful conference for them.
Well, we want to thank Bartle and Doug for a tour de force, and thank you for the paper as well.